Hey everyone, we're back today with another Forza car review, this time on the Fiat 124 Spider Abarth Edition. Now this car is also affectionately known as the Fiata because it's actually based off a Mazda Miata with the same chassis and the same transmission, but an Alfa Romeo engine. Now this means it'll be pretty difficult to separate the two cars from each other, but I'm going to do my best to isolate this car and review it as it is, and we'll get back on the comparisons a little later in the video. Now, the Fiat 124 has quite a bit of history in the automotive scene. First releasing in 1966, the Fiat 124 was a lightweight sports car with a 4-cylinder engine designed by an ex-Ferrari engineer. And by the end of its production in 1985, it had won 4 WRC championships, cementing its place in both rally and amateur autocross. Interestingly enough, I was actually offered to buy an old 124 that was used for autocross, but I turned it down. Luckily though, there's a new one, based on a Miata, and we're about to drive it in Forza. So let's take this thing on the road and give it a little first drive review. Alright, so first thing, the sound in the 124 is so much better than I was expecting, and I know I said I wouldn't do this quite yet, but I was expecting more of a Miata-like sound. Instead, what we have here is something with some real depth. It's bassy and crackles and pops. I love it. I feel like a lot of the sounds in Horizon 4 just kind of feel computer generated, and this is not one of those, and that helps a ton with the fun factor for driving the car. And speaking of fun factor, let's talk about the looks. Now, I'm not the hugest Fiat fan, and originally, especially from the front, this car just didn't excite me. But once I got in it and saw it from the back, spent a little more time with it, I really started to fall in love with it. I love the way it looks from the back, and even though I don't quite still like it from the front, it does flow really well, and I like the overall aesthetic that they were going for. But let's get serious. How does this thing really drive? Now, in its stock form, I felt pretty good. It's got a good bit of power, it's rear-wheel drive, which means oversteer, which means fun, and overall I felt pretty comfortable with it. Now, it's common for low-class cars to have a lot of body roll and pretty poor brakes, but this was a little bit worse than I was expecting, honestly. It's definitely going to need some suspension and brake upgrades and a good bit of tuning, but done right and with enough modification, I feel like this has the potential to be an S1 car. So with our first drive wrapping up, let's take this thing back to the garage and see what we can do to it. Alright, so starting with aero, let's see what we've got for options, and it looks like we're going to be stuck with the stock Forza front splitter and the beautiful as ever Forza stock rear wing. I was really hoping for like a ducktail spoiler or something else to control the downforce here, but it looks like we're not going to get that. Moving on to engine swaps, and our options are equally limited. We have the stock powertrain, which I think I'm going to try to keep, and a 1.6 inline-4 turbo rally engine, probably calling back to its rally heritage. I do appreciate that. Again, all-wheel drive drivetrain. I'm going to try and keep this thing rear-wheel drive, but in S1, it might be nice to switch to the all-wheel drive. And for tires, it also doesn't look like we have an offset option. Another bummer, but that's okay. This is a bit of a niche car, and I'll accept the lack of options. I do still like the stock vehicle. Now, that being said, I'm going to spend some time modifying the vehicle here and seeing where it fits. I hope I can get it into S1, but it might be more of an A-class car. Okay, so I am back from a long and admittedly somewhat disappointing tuning session with an A-Class, still rear-wheel drive tune for the Fiat 124 Spider. Now, just to talk about the tune a little bit, I am still using the stock engine, and like I said, it's still rear-wheel drive. I added the cage, admittedly just for looks. I think the cage looks great. Let's be honest, this car looks phenomenal. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I wasn't super sold on it, but it's been growing on me, and with that front splitter and some wheels and a little lowered, honestly, this is one of the better looking cars I've ever seen. I'm in love with the styling. Now for the tune, I tried to run sport tires to give myself a little extra room for power, but that's when I discovered the major fault of this car, and that's rear downforce. As we saw earlier, the only rear downforce option was the stock Forza wing, and I just could not bring myself to put it on. It completely ruins the styling of this car. So I left it off thinking it'd be fine, and well, it wasn't. I struggled a lot with this tune, and no matter what I did, it was still just so tail happy. I could get the oversteer under control and predictable, but I just couldn't get it to stay grippy through a corner. This also meant that I couldn't have put the car into S1 class without throwing on that spoiler, and for what it's worth, I would have had to engine swap and all-wheel drive swap as well. So with that said, here's what I created. We've got an A-Class road tune coming in at 294 horsepower on the stock engine and weighing 2,201 pounds, still rear-wheel drive. Let's see how it does on the test track. So getting out and running on the test track really confirmed my concerns with this car. If you remember my Datsun review, that had about 110 more horsepower and weighed I think 500 pounds less. It was much faster, just to spoil things. And this car just didn't have the power, it didn't have the grip. The one thing it did have though was a lot of fun. Again, this car looks amazing, and although being tail happy and sliding around all the corners isn't fast, it was really fun. Managing the oversteer in this car didn't really feel like a chore, it almost felt more like a hobby. I wanted to push myself and I wanted to push the car to that outside edge of the road. Even though I was falling back in time, you can probably see a little bit from the footage that it was just fun to kick the rear end out. But when I got to the end of my run, the ugly truth was revealed. Let's look at the lap time. So this being an A-Class car, we're looking to compare it against the Datsun 510 from our previous video, as well as a Mazda RX-7 that I played with a bit when the game first came out. And the Fiat 124 Spider Abarth edition did the lap in 2:44.318, just barely beating out my old RX-7 and falling seriously short of the old Datsun 510. All that's left to do now is give the car some scores. Now, in my last review video, you guys left some great feedback, some of which included creating a better scoring system for the cars that was a little bit easier to understand, and some of you guys also made reference to Doug DeMuro's videos. Now, with that being said, I will be debuting the HokiScore system in my next review video. I wish it was ready for this video. I've had a lot of fun making the system, but I've just been busy with family and Thanksgiving, and wanted to put this video out here first. So we're going to be doing a slightly unique scoring system for this video. So starting with road course driving, this car gets a 0 out of Miata. It just doesn't live up to the racing pedigree that the Miata has, which is sad because there's a lot of history to the 124 in motorsport. Maybe it just didn't translate well into the Forza games, but I just can't find any reason to recommend this car over a Miata for road racing. Now for rally, this car gets a Fiata out of Miata. They're basically the same as far as rally goes. Now, the 124 has a little bit more history in rally racing, and I can respect that for sure, but when it comes to practicality in the Forza games, I can't really find any reason to pick one over the other. Now for drifting, I'll give the car a 4 out of Miata. It drifts fine, but again, I can't find any reason to choose this over the Miata when the Miata has more body kit options, better fitment options, more drifting style. Again, it just comes down to Fiata versus Miata, and Miata wins here one more time. Now, finally, let's talk fun factor. And I'm giving this a Fiata out of Fiata. This car manages somehow to completely separate itself from the feel of a Miata. Even though it's based on the same chassis, it looks entirely different, it drives fairly different as well, and it has its own unique style to it, and I really appreciate that. Like I said earlier in the video, I have fallen in love with the styling of this car, and even though I wish it handled and drove a lot better than it does, I still had fun with it, and that's why I still, on some level, feel fine recommending this car to you guys. It's so much fun. If you like the styling, if you like the sound, just drive this thing in the open world. It's a great cruising car. And on that note, it's time to close out our review on the Fiat 124 Spider Abarth edition. Now, usually at the end of my videos, I like to talk a bit about what's coming next for the channel, but I've got a lot to say, so go ahead and check out the description. I'll write everything down there if you have any interest in reading it. And thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.